My name is Thoko Moyo. I'm actually connecting from Boston, Massachusetts. I'm at Harvard University, and it's my immense pleasure to be the moderator of this session, From Words to Action. How do we build a resilient, sustainable mobility? Now, as you know, this session is being hosted by the Sum for All initiative, and Sum for All stands for Sustainable Mobility for All. Is probably the most significant global advocacy platform for international cooperation on sustainable transport and mobility. It's a coalition of over 50 public and private organizations, from bilateral partners, multilateral development banks, UN agencies, intergovernmental organizations and global civil society, as well as UN organizations. Now, these organizations have come together because they share a common ambition to try and transform the future of mobility and to make transport safer, greener, efficient, and accessible to all. And there's now a sharpened and urgent focus on ensuring that efforts for sustainable mobility incorporate resilience. Let me tell you a little bit more about Sum for All and where we are up to now. So since its inception, Sum for All has developed a vast body of knowledge, expertise, and policy tools to support this transition towards sustainable mobility. And among them are a tool which is used to diagnose specific transport and mobility issues in a country. And once you have a deeper understanding of what those issues are, Sum for All has also developed a way to guide what actions a country can take to address these issues. And this is done through the Global Roadmap of Action, or GRA. And if you were here last year, you'd have heard and seen the launch of the GRA. Now, the GRA is a catalog of policy measures that a country can adopt, customized for the specific issues that it's facing in its transition to sustainable mobility. Another key development last year was when South Africa announced that it wanted some help from Sum for All to accelerate its progress in attaining the SDGs and also the future of its transport policy. And since then, the country has piloted the use of the country diagnostic and the GRA. And you'll get to hear a little bit about how that's going shortly. And then later on, I'll interview a panel of experts who've done a deep dive on some of the policy measures and how to translate them into action. We'll hear about the types of policy recommendations that are emerging on key issues like data sharing, the nexus between energy and transport, and e-mobility. So there's a lot that we're planning to get through in this session for the hour that we have. So we should probably get started, but just a quick reminder, if you have questions, post them in the chat, which I can see, and we'll try and get to them. And if you're on social media and you're tweeting, please remember to hashtag Sum for All. So let's get started. You see on the screen with me right now is Nancy Vandycke. She's the head of Sum for All. Now, Nancy, as I mentioned, last Sum for All was here to launch the GRA, and we're going to be hearing more about how work is going on the ground in South Africa. But there's just a lot of work that's going on right now as we think about the transition to sustainable mobility. So tell us briefly some of the surprising elements that are starting to emerge and that are shaping the future of sustainable mobility since the launch of the GRA last year.
Yes, thank you, Thoko, and of course, very happy to be here and host this session at Transforming Transportation. Indeed, you're right, a lot has been happening since we launched this global roadmap of action last year at Transforming Transportation. The context in which we designed that catalog of policy measures is indeed very different than the one we are in today. And so from my perspective, the very big difference is that at the time when we designed this catalog of measures, we assumed that the world was predictable, certain, stable, and that it was just a question of political will to get anything done. Of course, what we have learned with the COVID crisis is that the world is not certain. There is a lot of fragility of our economies, and there is still a lot that we don't know. So what are the implications for transport? First, transport and mobility conversations have been going on for many years. And so the question is, what is the value added of an initiative like Sustainable Mobility for All? We believe that Some for All is really bringing a very fresh perspective on the conversation on transport and mobility through three aspects. First, the way we look at transport is not traditional. Generally, we look at transport as the addition of public transportation, private cars, railway lines, airplanes. The way we look at in Some for All at transport is as a complex system that has the ambition to deliver on four goals: universal access, efficiency, safety, and green mobility. Now, of course, that transport system is not evolving on its own. It is interacting with many other systems. The energy system is an obvious one, but as we have learned from the COVID crisis, also the health system. So that perspective, that systemic perspective, is really an innovative contribution to the discussion on transport. The second big contribution is in terms of believing in the power of data and evidence. In the past, a lot of the transport conversation with client countries was based on anecdotal evidence, ad hoc assessments, but now we have data. Data not only provided by the public sector, but also the private sector. So we have a huge amount of data. We have now methodologies, we have artificial intelligence. And so what we can bring to the table is a high level of objectivity and precision in the way we diagnose mobility issues in countries and the way we quantify those issues in countries. So that is the second big contribution. Third, but very importantly, is once you have the diagnostic, what do? So what we are bringing to the plate is this coherent policy framework. And this is where the GRA and the action plan will come into play. And we will hear in a minute about this new approach to diagnose issues and this new approach to generate action plan so that we have actions in countries that are based on data and evidence and on a coherent policy framework. As a final word, I would say that we are very excited by the direction in which Some for All is evolving. We started by investing massively into knowledge. We had to fill huge knowledge gaps. We had to establish our technical credibility. We had to establish thought leadership and advocate globally. But we are now finally equipped with the tools, the data, the approach to engage with countries and test many of those ideas and many of those tools in client countries. So this is a very exciting point for all of us. And we believe that these are critical building blocks to build a resilient transport system that will deliver on our ambition, which is universal access, efficiency, safe, and green mobility.
That was an excellent snapshot of everything that you've been working on. And it's really interesting and exciting to hear about this focus on data, evidence, and using that to inform the action plans that are necessary for countries to be able to start addressing some of the issues that they have identified in their transition to green mobility. So Gurpreet is on the screen and he's going to be giving us a little more detail actually focused on the countries and what's going on. So let me introduce you properly. So Gurpreet, thank you very much, Nancy. She's just left the room. So now I turn to you, Gurpreet. Gurpreet is an economist at the World Bank and is with the Some for All initiative. And he's going to be giving us a sneak peek into how the action is happening on the ground, focused on the country diagnostic in South Africa. Gurpreet, thank you so much, and over to you.
Thank you, Thoko. Good day to all the participants and attendees of today's session. It is my distinct pleasure to deliver this presentation on the diagnostic of South Africa's mobility system. So to begin, allow me to take a moment to shed some light on the context, of course, building on what has already been discussed. The activity stems from Some for All's announcement at TTDC 20 that South Africa would be the first country to pilot Some for All tools. So this diagnostic is the first stage of a broader picture, what we call a theory of change. The overall idea, as mentioned, is to use data and evidence to help guide countries in making better policy and investment choices that support a transition towards sustainable mobility and the SDGs at large, while embedding systemic resilience to shocks. Now, we'll hear more on the subsequent stages in the next presentation, but I will highlight that the trust of the theory of change is vested in Sum4All's cutting-edge tools and global experience of Sum4All members and partners. So, without further ado, let's get into the diagnostic. The effort involved over 15 Sum4All member organizations who volunteered to join and participate in a dedicated working group. In this spirit, working group members contributed data from secondary sources, much of which was their own, and published survey data. The unique value of this diagnostic is that it considers all modes of transportation while simultaneously looking at the 4 goals of sustainable mobility as highlighted by Nancy, which are universal access, efficiency, safety, and green mobility. The methodology itself covers 3 linked stages. The first is country benchmarking, and we do this in 3 ways. One is to look at how the country performs against the rest of the world. Second is how it performs against countries at a similar level of development. And finally, we look at how it performs against countries in a similar region. Now, the next stage is to leverage this benchmarking to discover areas where the country ranks low, as this suggests that underperformance is present. We call this gap analysis. Now, these first 2 stages, whilst very useful, they may mask spatial or population heterogeneity. We therefore leverage a 3rd stage, which we call complementary drill downs, to understand the differences found in the gap analysis and the drivers of these outcomes. So now, to understand this by example, let's look at some preliminary findings from this diagnostic. And I'll start off with the benchmarking. So the spider chart you see on your screen depicts South Africa's performance on 6 dimensions of sustainable mobility vis-a-vis all countries in the world. On each dimension, the best performing country is marked at 100, while the least best performing country is marked at 0. Now, looking at the overall picture, a larger area marked in green will signify better relative performances, while a smaller area suggests otherwise. From this, on each dimension, we can infer the gap between South Africa's performance, or rather any country's performance, from the best performing country in the world. Now, if we can use one example, and I'll pick safety, to look at what we're finding from this graph and how we can move to a granular level. So what we see on the graph is that South Africa's sustainability rating is about 30. And from there, we can infer that the sustainability gap is 70. So with that, then, I'd like to elaborate slightly on how we make sense and dig deeper into that first benchmark and that gap. So I'll start with a figure that now we see on the left of the screen. Now, this is similar to the benchmarking and gap analysis that was done previously, but now we narrow down the range of countries that we compare South Africa to from initially using the whole world. Now we use comparator countries that have a similar level of income and a similar region to the country. Now, while this is helpful to see where the country stands vis-a-vis respective peer groups, we can only truly make sense of the drivers of this gap by looking at a deeper level. And that's where the drill downs on the right-hand side of your screen come in handy. So for example, and of course the drill downs include several, these are just examples of a snapshot that's on your screens. So top right, we look at time series analysis to see what the trend is like for fatalities in South Africa. And so what we see there is a trend that suggests that more may need to be done to reach the goal of halving road fatalities by 2030. As we know, we are entering the 2nd decade of action on road safety. Now, in another drill down, and this is the one on the bottom right of your screen, we look at what's happening across provinces. And the reason for that is we want to explore whether there's spatial heterogeneity over time. So we do notice a difference between provinces, and this may be the result of several underlying variables. One could be differences in road conditions across provinces, or there may be differences in institutional capacity between provinces, or there could be differences in effective implementation of standards. I would enjoy nothing more than to go on further on the drill downs and the analysis on other goals, but in the interest of time, I will leave it at this example. But before I close, I would like to outline the next steps as Sum for All finalizes this diagnostic of South Africa's mobility system. We will do, the next steps include, first, to validate the findings of the draft diagnostic with national and local partners in South Africa. Simultaneously, we'll also conduct further drill down analysis on all dimensions to account for spatial or population heterogeneity. And last but not least, we'll also be filling in the data gaps, specifically on those areas that require that need some more attention. With that, I'd like to thank you for your time and hand it back over to Thoko. Thank you.
Gurpreet, thank you very much for that. While we still have you on the screen, I have a couple of questions. I mean, this was a really very, very fascinating presentation, and it really underscores the importance of data, particularly if you're thinking of using it to sort of influence and inform your actions and policies going forward. But it really does hinge on collecting or gathering good data. So could you maybe just tell us a little bit about what your experience was in South Africa, given that there are always data limitations? What was your experience?
No, very good question. Thank you so much for raising this, Thoko. Thoko, I'll start by saying that in any sector, the availability of reliable and consistent data is always a challenge. In transport, it's even more pronounced. As we all know, transport does not have a dedicated SDG and therefore cannot benefit from the SDG framework for indicators, goals, and targets. Now, thankfully for this activity, we relied on Sum for All's global tracking framework, which was basically established 4 years ago, updated in 2020, and it basically identifies goals and indicators for sustainable mobility that are aligned with the SDGs. Now, additionally, I would also like to credit the great effort of Sum for All members who came together to put their data sets and contribute to the efforts of this activity. And I think that's my key takeaway, that without partnership, collaboration, and data sharing, this would not be possible.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thanks so much, Gurpreet. This was really fantastic. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Great. So as we've said before, the idea is that the diagnostic gives a sense of some of the mobility issues that a country is facing. And you then can maybe think about how to guide those actions using the GRA, which is the Global Roadmap for Action. So maybe let's hear a little bit more about the GRA and some of the changes and updates that are being made to it. And to help us do that is José Viegas, who's on the screen right now. And José is an international transport expert and the former Secretary General of the International Transport Forum. José, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much, Thoko. It's a pleasure to be here. Allow me to say that I've looked at the list of participants in this session, and I've seen so many names that I was used to see in the ITF summits and the Transforming Transportation earlier sessions. I regret that I cannot see them, but at least they can see me. And I hope that possibly next year we can meet again live in Transforming Transportation. Okay, let me, sorry, yes.
No, you can get started, but I mean, I just wanted to ask you the question to get you to kick off, which is, tell us about what this GRA 2.2 is and how it will help countries achieve sustainable transport and mobility that is safe, efficient, green, and is accessible. So
let me just correct you. You said GRA 2.2. We are not yet there. We are still at 2.0.
2.0. Sorry, that's an aspiration. So
okay. So GRA 2.2 is really the how should I say, the action plans that we are producing now, which try to be a new form of response to the difficulties we've said. As Nancy said, we have understood now more clearly that the world is not as stable, as predictable as before. We've heard from Gurpreet about the diagnostic. I'm going to talk to you mostly about the prototype action plan, which brings these things together, and why it is prototype, it will be clear in a moment. As of last year, when we launched GRA 1.0, we had a catalog of 182 policy measures which were parked in 4 toolboxes: one legal and regulatory measures, another one economical and financial, third one on technological and engineering, and the fourth one communications. And they were produced by the consortium, and they were supposed to represent a set of measures that would be able to address the challenges in all the countries in the world in moving towards sustainability in the 4 dimensions that we had. Then we had the difficulty of how can we make a tool that will allow a coherent approach to the very different challenges across all the countries in the world. And because there were many measures, 182, and by coincidence, a very similar number, 183 countries, it was clear from the beginning that this had to be with a computerized algorithm. But because of the high level of the measures, a certain abstraction, this cannot be considered an action plan ready for implementation. This is a prototype, which is a good basis, we hope, for dialogue and discussion with the authorities and other stakeholders in the recipient countries, but it should not be confused with a ready to start an action plan that is ready for implementation. Now, in early 2020, as we know, in March, the world became aware that we had a pandemic going on, and the consortium asked the team to see if we were able to include consideration of resilience in our reflections, in our work. And we think we were able to do that. The first thing we have to understand is that resilience is a system feature, not component by component. And transport, as Nancy already said, is clearly a system, which is also part of the wider societal systems. In discussing what kinds of resilience, we went to study a bit, and it was clear from very early on that we have to consider resilience in 2 different aspects. The one is the immediate response to the shock, to the crisis. The other one is the capacity to recover in a reasonable amount of time and hopefully to conditions which are as good as or sometimes even better than before. We identified that besides the pandemic, it would be very appropriate already at this time to also include consideration for resilience against extreme weather events. We also identified the third type of shock, which is the IT and cybercrime events, but we found about that it is too complex we would not be able to be here today covering an equivalent level of treatment of these issues if we had included that aspect. So that one was left to the side for future endeavors. Then we went to look all over those 182 measures and see to what extent do they include some preparation, some resilience coverage. And we felt that some of them indeed had already some component of that, but that was not enough. So with the help of the consortium, we produced an additional set of 12 measures that were specifically designed to enhance the resilience of transport systems. The list is here on the screen. I'm not going to read them. Believe me, this was done with peer review, and we think it is a very decent additional coverage of the set of measures. Now, what about the algorithm? It was a revised version of the algorithm of last year. We had found a weakness in the compatibility between the impact of each measure on the policy goals and the relevance of that measure to the situation of the country. We improved the combination of these 2 aspects. And we also included the resilience aspects. But in doing that and doing the first tests, we also concluded that there was the risk that our prototype action plans could be weak, could be unbalanced in the coverage of different parts, different segments of the transport, let me call it market. What we called in the end domains of incidence. This is totally modal agnostic, so we are considering the areas of demand. So we put 3 domains for passengers: urban, intercity, and international, and 2 for freight, domestic and international. And so the action plans that are being produced by the algorithm also include the evaluation of the balance of coverage across these 5 domains. This picture tries to sum up the logic of the algorithm. So the first layer is a small set of measures that are chosen so as to maximize the impact on the policy goals and or on the resilience aspects. This is a relatively thin layer. Then we go into an iterative procedure in which each additional measure is chosen as to maximize the global contribution to reach the satisfaction thresholds, which were defined in advance, but doing it in a balanced way across the different policy goals and resilience aspects. And then when we have this first part finished, we go and look at domains of incidence, and if they are not properly balanced, a few measures can be added to reach a minimum of balance across domains of incidence so that all transport sectors can feel represented. Finally, we have seen that some countries are seriously lacking, seriously underperforming in some domain of incidence. For instance, for some countries, the intercity transport or the international freight or whatever. We do an analysis by comparing the country with its peers, or a benchmarking analysis, and if a particular country is less than 75% of the median value with those countries in any of the domains of incidence, we do a step of positive discrimination of measures which are addressing that domain of incidence so that we can help that country more quickly converge to cover the gap in that particular domain of incidence. So these are the 4 steps. The fourth one is only happening if that underperformance is occurring. And what we found is that in the case of South Africa, this was not happening, so the prototype action plan for South Africa only has the 3 first steps in that algorithm. We have about 30 measures there, and they can be classified in different types, different sorts of things. We could have used here the toolboxes, but for easier understanding of the type of things that we have inside, we used another classification. So we have measures for data sharing about the standardization of the reporting and the capacity across levels of government to handle these new large volumes of data. Then the necessity to integrate energy and transport in a national transport plan and the consultation of stakeholders. And finally, for e-mobility, the question of introducing the new modes, particularly the smart urban mobility modes, and then to share knowledge and successes and best practices. This is just a highlight of a small set of measures that are in that action plan. And given the reduced time, I would love to go on, but I think this is all for the moment. Thoko, I pass you the word. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Jose. Actually, I think we have just a few more minutes. I wanted to ask you a question. So my understanding of the sort of logical sequence of the diagnostic tool and the global roadmap for action is you do the diagnostic, you get a sense of what are the issues in the country. And once you've identified them, you use those issues to then develop what sort of action plan for addressing this. Now, is that how it actually works in practice? I mean, is that the
Not exactly.
Okay, so tell me how exactly.
Yeah. No, in the algorithmic part, we work with less data than in the diagnostic because we work at a higher level. So we have more aggregate data, and the two things have worked in parallel. Mm-hmm. And the diagnostic will be extremely helpful to bring down the prototype action plan closer to the ground because it has a more detailed level of information. Many more indicators have been used there. And this will help this transition from the high level of abstraction on the path to a very concrete set of proposals. It is not yet there, but I would say it's a kind of mid-level, it's a mezzanine thing that will allow, when we have the prototype action plan ready and the diagnostic ready, which will be in the next few weeks, it should be possible to then say, okay, let's make the declination of each of the measures in the prototype action plan. How could they be specified at the level corresponding to the diagnostic we have? And this will prepare the team of the bank to go for the dialogue with the local and national authorities with a much richer set of information and founded on actual data. But the data that is used in the diagnostic is much richer and possibly not all available for the different countries at the same variables at the same level. So this is much more country specific. The algorithm has to use data that is commonly available for all the countries so that we can have a consistent approach.
And great. So Lucia has posted a question in the chat. Why is land use or urban development and transportation planning not taken into account?
I would say, who said so? If you take a careful look at the measures in the table of measures, even in the original 182, there are some there that speak specifically about this question. You know, in my roots, I was an urban planner. This is something I would not have left out.
Okay, well, terrific. And I'm sure
but there were many more contributors in that direction. I was not the author of those measures, but it's something that was very, very present in the discussion. So don't worry, it's there.
Okay, that's great. And Lucia says, thank you. They will check them out. Fantastic, Jose. Thank you so much for your time and for presenting what's happening with the GRA 2.0. And Jose Viegas, as I mentioned, is an international transport expert and the former Secretary General of the International Transport Forum. So now we've heard about how the country diagnostic tool is working on the ground in South Africa. I had an opportunity to hear a little bit more about the GRA and how it's being updated in a world that is very uncertain and where we're facing a lot of fragility and risks such as and including what we've seen with the COVID crisis and of course climate change. So now we're going to talk to a panel of experts who can give us a sense around some of what they are learning and some of the policy recommendations coming out in 3 specific policy areas in the GRA 2.0, which actually Jose also spoke about. This is private and public data sharing, e-mobility, and the transport energy nexus. And so to help me discuss this, you're seeing on your screen right now, we have Aman Chitkara, who is the Manager Mobility at the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. We also have Clotilde Rossi di Schio. Clotilde, I always, I'm sorry about that. Clotilde is a senior specialist at the senior specialist for energy efficiency at Sustainable Energy for All, also known as C4All, and Daniel Ernesto Moser, who is the head of the Transformative Urban Mobility Initiative at GIZ. Welcome all of you. Thank you so much for joining us. What I want to try and do in the time that we have together is get a sense of what you have seen in the reports that you're going to be publishing soon in these areas that we've specified, and then also look at some specific policy recommendations that are coming up that you've done, and then maybe get a sense of what happens next. How do we actually turn this from words into action? So why don't I start with you, Aman, and ask you, we've heard already that South Africa last year approached Some4All with a request for assistance with their plans for accelerating progress towards the SDGs and also the future of their transport policy. We've heard from Gurpreet that we've pulled together data and we've actually come up with the first diagnostic of South Africa's transport system. And next month, I believe your organization, the World Business Council for Sustainable Development and the International Road Federation is actually going to be launching a report which emphasizes the importance of data sharing. So maybe let's just start with a very basic question. Why is this so important? Why should policymakers be caring about sharing of data across the various stakeholders?
Great. Thank you so much for that question. Really pleased to be here. So just if we recall the conversation that the VP of World Bank, Mr. Maktar Diop, and the Mayor of Freetown, Yvonne Aki-Soya, were talking about the need to give people mobility choices as they rise up the income and wealth ladder, keep them away from cars, to use shared and active modes of transportation, avoid costly infrastructure projects by optimizing the utilization of existing infrastructure. That requires a digitally integrated multimodal transportation system. If we want to target specific customer groups and nudge them towards more sustainable behaviors, that again requires a shared data ecosystem. We talk about a 30-minute city. planning and operation of that type of a city will also require data aggregation and sharing between multiple different sources. City governments want to regulate transportation modes, plan for the future. Again, we require data coming from all of these different sources: public transportation, from mobility service providers, from banking, from telecom, from the city itself. So what we see is that shared data will constitute the nervous system of future sustainable urban mobility systems. It will be necessary to operate, plan, and regulate our transportation systems in the future. While data by itself may not be sufficient, data sharing between multiple stakeholders will underpin more efficient transportation systems that are better for the environment. Some for All's global roadmap of action that previous speakers talked about identified supporting data sharing programs and platforms as a key policy measure that can help in the transition towards a green, safe, more accessible, more efficient, and now more resilient mobility system in all countries. So what we're seeing here is that a sound policy framework is vital to the development of such a data sharing ecosystem, doing it in a way that respects privacy of all different entities and users, do it in a way that's ethical and equitable, but also think about the broader economic implications. We want to create a more innovative marketplace, and again, policy can have a major role in directing the mobility ecosystem and data sharing ecosystem towards those goals.
Thanks, Aman. And actually, I'm glad that you touched on some of the sort of values in the approach to data sharing, because that was a question that was sort of formulating in my mind. And maybe I want you to just go back and emphasize that a little bit. You touched on it, that you want to do the data sharing in a way that sort of respects privacy. I mean, there'll obviously be issues around competition as well. So maybe let me just take you back. So if you can just emphasize some of the values approach towards this data sharing as you do this work.
Absolutely. So I think there are a few fundamental themes that we tried to think about as we developed this policy framework. So in all, we've identified 5 different policy areas that policymakers should consider when they think about regulating data sharing. So everything from data collection and merging to standards, to thinking about the infrastructure through which data is being shared, governance and accountability, and then finally use and analysis. Within these 5 areas, we've identified about 33 policy recommendations, which again depend on the local context. But across all of these 33 suggestions, there are these fundamental themes that you're talking about. One, of course, is to align the data sharing initiatives to the achievement of sustainable mobility objectives. Second is to ensure that some of the core public values that you talked about, equity, privacy, security, are being ensured. Third, we need to be able to make sure that the broader economic value that is created by data sharing is used to establish a more fair and competitive marketplace, which prevents data monopolies and supports innovative organizations of all sizes. It shouldn't just be one tech company or one data company that kind of holds all data and has the capability to monetize that data. This next theme is more around creating a harmonized data sharing approach across various different jurisdictions. And then the final thing that we're talking about is to ensure that you're generating economic value and building a high-skilled labor pool for an innovative technology-based data economy.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that. So maybe let me come to you now, Clotilde, and talk about some of the work that you've been doing at C4All. So you're leading a working group that looks at e-mobility and the nexus with transport. And along with other partners, I believe that you've been gathering existing resources, tools, and references and making them available to policymakers to address specific issues around the nexus of transport and energy. So maybe let me just ask you, what sort of opportunity have you identified to address both energy and transport together? And what does this mean for policymakers?
Thank you very much, Thoko. Thank you very much for having me and speak on behalf of the Energy and Transport Nexus Working Group. Energy and mobility are very, very relevant, and the nexus of the two sectors is very relevant, as both transport energy consumption and emission are expected to double by 2050, but at the same time, millions of people don't have access to electricity or mobility service. So there is an opportunity to leverage this nexus and to leverage the synergies that can be created when addressing both energy and mobility from the outset. So indeed, very often it is when discussing energy or major infrastructure projects in transport and or in energy, these are undertaken separately, while we would advocate for the two sectors and the stakeholders to make sure that their priorities are aligned as transport is fed by energy. We see, for example, the opportunity when following the Avoid, Shift, Improve framework to link the two sectors together. Just giving a few examples. If you look at the integration of land use, transport, and energy planning, you can make sure to avoid those travels that are not necessary while providing the services through energy, while powering services along the way. For instance, when thinking of the shift, which is basically looking at more efficient modes of transportation, you can promote very energy efficiency modes as walking and cycling, but also public transport systems, and which are, again, something that have been touched earlier and is very important to consider in a safe way also during pandemic, and improve the available technology through more stringent fuel economy standards and through electrification, so electric vehicles, and also promote behavioral change, for example, through policy as congestion charging.
That's a very helpful overview. And in fact, as you were talking, I was just thinking that there is a connection with what Aman was talking about, data sharing as well, I'd imagine, in this work that you're doing. Do you want to just say a little bit about that very quickly?
So indeed, there is actually many touching points, both with Aman working group, but also with a Daniel working group, as it's then touching more on the mobility side. So indeed, there is an opportunity to shift the system and to have the technology available. One also of the policy measure that we looked more in detail relates to plan for integrating multimodal transport networks. And there, of course, data is extremely important, is key for being able to plan for any integrated network. And then other, when we look at new mobility solution, so car sharing and, you know, the utilization of e-scooters or mobility solutions that are just bike sharing are just needs a data platform. And with cell phone penetration data and cell phone being more and more utilized, there is a growing opportunity around the world for this.
So Daniel, let me turn to you now. So the theme of this year's transportation conference is reimagining safe and resilient mobility for recovery. And at the center of the discussions is this issue of e-mobility, well, rather there seems to be a drive towards transport decarbonization, and at the center of that is a discussion of sustainable electric mobility or e-mobility. So from your experience leading the working group on e-mobility under the Some for All Secretariat, tell us one surprising element that we can expect to see in the report that's about to be published about this work.
Yes, thank you, Thoko, and absolutely right. We're acting in a framework of great urgency with the climate crisis moving forward. And this is especially where we are seeing electric mobility making incredible strides. So one surprising element, and I think this is really surprising even to the experts in the room when we talk about electric mobility, are the incredible dynamics which we are seeing at play when we talk about electric mobility. So just look, 2 or 3 years ago, we weren't even talking about the end of the internal combustion engine. This was a very niche topic 2 or 3 years ago, and now we've seen last week that major car manufacturers, in fact 76% of the global car sales volume for manufacturers has indicated that they will be moving away from internal combustion engines in the next years. So this is pretty significant. And I think this is also surprising, a surprising dynamic which we have to keep in our minds, that as we move forward, the cost reductions are so incredible, which we are seeing due to the advancement of technology, that we will be continued to be surprised about the novel applications which are coming into place and which we are going to see in the world. So this is, I think, a very important fact which we have to keep in mind. And this is also something which speaks a little bit about the applications where we can expect electric mobility to succeed. So right now, we're talking a lot about electric cars, but an unsung success story, which we are also seeing, is electric bikes, electric tricycles. Smaller electric vehicles are really taking off in terms of demand. And this is great, also considering what we heard earlier from Clotilde and from Aman, is that this is really a significant contributor also to our goals in sustainable mobility. And also on the other side, when we look at heavier freight which has to be moved, or looking at mass transit, for example, we do see very, very strong dynamics towards electrification, with electric trucks, class 8 haulers being announced, but also looking at electric buses, which are seeing an incredible surge in demand all around the world.
And so tell me a little bit about that you've mentioned of these smaller electric vehicles, the e-bikes and the scooters. Is that globally, or is that happening in specific regions of the world?
Yes, this is actually happening all around the world, and this is there's a very, very simple reason for this. If you look a couple of years back, you would see most of the smaller vehicles not being motorized at all, or being motorized with highly polluting as well as inefficient two-stroke engines. So now we do see a revolution which enables us to use quite cheaply and widely available smaller vehicles, which allow us to extend the application of these vehicles quite drastically. So when you walk through many cities around the world, you will now see local delivery vehicles in three-wheeler size being powered by electric engines. You will also see many people switching their commute to electric bicycles, because electric bicycles allows people to go much further with their pedaling power than it was electrifying the bicycles.
And so again, we're seeing action with the work that Clotilde and that working group has been doing, so that nexus with the energy sector as well, really coming into play there.
Absolutely.
So let's start talking about some policy recommendations. So Aman, let me come back to you. So you've impressed upon us the importance of policymakers facilitating data sharing amongst the various stakeholders. So tell me in sort of concrete and specific terms, what might be one policy recommendation that your working group is making to foster this data sharing?
I'm sorry, I might have to go slightly against the question, because mobility at the end of the day is extremely hyperlocal. What's applicable in one city may not quite apply elsewhere. Policymakers around the world have adopted quite different approaches towards data sharing. And many of these are influenced by the relationship between different actors within a city. What's the role of business versus what's the role of government? What's the digital maturity of a given geography? What's the regulatory environment like? So to try and cover all of these different variables, we did offer several suggestions, and we offered several case studies in our report. But if I were to kind of boil it down to a couple of big call to actions, one would be the need to adopt more of a collaborative approach for data sharing between different stakeholders. So here again, I'm talking about policymakers, I'm talking about citizens and civil society members, businesses, and academia. First, for the definition of a common vision for sustainable urban mobility and how data sharing is expected to deliver to those objectives. I think parallel to that is the principle of what we're calling purpose specification and data minimization. So essentially saying, thinking about the minimum amount of data that needs to be collected towards explicitly stated purposes with the appropriate level of consent from all the different parties that are generating that data. Especially true for, of course, data going from businesses to governments, for regulation or planning purposes. And the last thing that I would mention is the need to create shared value, to essentially overcome the initial hurdle for sharing data. So you need to be able to share whatever economic or non-economic value that you're creating from data sharing between the various parties who are in that consortium. So again, share that value as broadly as possible. Folks said sharing is caring. I would kind of bring it back to the same thing.
Okay, and Clotilde, this comes to you. So we're trying to avoid the energy and the transport sectors working in silos. In the work that you've been doing and in the report that you're about to publish, what might be a sort of policy recommendation or a call to action that you would make to policymakers to try and facilitate the bridging of the gap between transport and energy sectors?
Yes, thank you. So maybe it's helpful to state that we have been working on 3 specific GRA measures. One refers to promote public discussion on new mobility solution, expanding public transport infrastructure, and plan for integrated multimodal transport network. And so we have identified a 4-step guide for policymakers to be able to leverage existing documents and resources. Basically a 4-step guide can go from data, what data are available, what is the baseline, to go which kind of targets should be set, and what is the strategy to achieve. So it's actually very hands-on, and there are a number of suggestions along the way, as well as resources available. So there are also a set of suggestions for each of these 3 measures that they really touch on different needs and different. So maybe just referring to freight, the primary suggestion we have for policymakers is to look at efficiency, energy efficiency, but also then when the most efficient systems has been picked, to look then at alternative fuel sources and more energy and cleaner fuels. And to make sure to have the right stakeholders and the right discussion have in place, as well as involving the private sector. So,
okay, and Daniel, what are you sort of highlighting as some of the policy recommendations that you might make with regards to e-mobility?
Yes, thank you, Thoko. So, as part of our work and our extensive stakeholder analysis and research, which we conducted during the creation of the final result, which will be public very soon, we identified 3 key action fields containing 7 essential building blocks towards successful implementation of e-mobility. And these 3 action fields are first, vision, second, policy, and third, implementation. And all of these key action fields are obviously interconnected and are supporting each other as well as reinforcing each other. So let me give you just one example, because it would be too much to go through all of this. When you talk about a vision around e-mobility, you will have to build momentum with your constituencies, as well as raise awareness. Now, how does this happen? So what we see in many places around the world, when they do it successfully, we do see pilot projects as a first element of bringing e-mobility to the ground. So then we can create a facilitative learning environment, which helps policymakers to understand the intricate challenges around implementing e-mobility strategies. Mm-hmm. But you don't have a successful pilot with good follow-up if you don't learn from this and set the right policy framework just after that, and also create an iterative learning process which helps you to adjust the policy framework according to your learnings. Yeah. So just a spotlight, but this is really the direction which we're going into.
Mm-hmm. We're almost out of time, but I do want to just keep to the spirit of the session, which is moving from words to action. So I think we've got time for a lightning round. I want to ask each of you, so where do we go from here? What do we need to do to translate this work into action and to help countries achieve their goals for resilient and sustainable mobility? How do we actually ensure that calls to action, policy recommendations are actually put into practice? So Aman, why don't you start?
Sure. I think what we've done through this work is really brought down the recommendations that were outlined in the GRA from 30,000 foot level to 5,000 foot level. Mm-hmm. But actually be able to kind of get to that last little bit, we need to kind of, again, conduct some demonstration projects through iterative experimentation and fast failure approaches, exactly what Daniel was talking about. So we want to be able to kind of work with cities to conduct these demonstration projects, demonstrate the value that can be created through specific use cases, and work in partnership to essentially identify the policy interventions to bring these to fruition, and of course to be able to kind of scale and replicate these. So of course, we welcome to any city partnerships at this point in time, and would love to hear more.
Fantastic. Clotilde, how do we go from words to action?
I will be echoing both Dana and Aman, as we also see the opportunity really to, as we try to look at these specific measures and to create these 4-step guides to see how this is actually can be piloted and how this actually can really help this measure being applied. So, and we would like to see how this a real case, real project might actually be helped through the 4 steps and actually achieve these GRA measures.
Terrific. And Daniel, I'm going to give you the final word about if anything you want to add about how we actually get to practice, to action. But we also have a question in the chat for you, which is, are there any current examples of cities that are excelling in the programming? So if you can answer both those questions in 2 or 3 sentences, that would be terrific.
Absolutely. First of all, I want to make compliments also to you, Thoko, for the great moderation, and Aman and Clotilde for these contributions, which I do absolutely share. And I think what is really important, and this is also echoing what we heard, is that we go from words to action. So the key question right now is, how can we accelerate implementation in the fastest possible way on the ground? So that's also where we, as a work, and with the members of our working group within Some for All, are very, very happy about the opportunities which we are seeing arising around the world in terms of bringing electric mobility on the ground. And I do think, going to the question which we've seen in the chat, I do think there are a couple of leaders in electric mobility moving very strongly. Many of you might have read about Norway and how Norway is leading the way also in terms of electric vehicles. And there are also a lot of things cities themselves can do to accelerate e-mobility adoption through specific policies. I would like to highlight, for example, Paris and their actions towards accelerating electric mobility in the city.
Fantastic. Well, I'd really like to thank the three of you so much for this really illuminating and sort of very insightful conversation that we've just had, and really getting to the nitty-gritty of what it will take to actually get to a point where these things are being implemented in practice. And I think it's very helpful to have specific sort of calls to action as broadly as you can, knowing, as you mentioned, Aman, that some of these things are very country and context specific. But I think it was very useful to just get a sense of what sort of policy actions are emerging from the fantastic work that you're doing. So we're at time. I think what remains for me now is to just thank all our speakers today. Starting with Nancy from Some for All, who really helped us set the context and really understand a bit more about the exciting work that's being done to help the transition to sustainable and resilient mobility for all, and also who shared with us just how the tools, the diagnostic and the GRA, are working on a country level, and the updates that we need to make given the sorts of risks and shocks and the fragility that we experience. And I think we're all very familiar with what's just happened with the COVID crisis, but also looking ahead to other potential issues such as climate change that could affect the transport sector. And then, of course, to the three of you for really taking us through the work that you're doing at a sort of deeper level to look at how these things translate into practice. My name's Thoko Moyo. It's been fantastic being with all of you. If you've been on social media, please tweet using the hashtag #SomeForAll. And I think if you were following the chat, there's an email address that you can use to send any questions or comments or any additional things that you would like to get clarified from the Some for All team. So for me, thank you so much. Thanks for joining us. And I guess we'll see you again next year.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.